A very warm welcome to you all. Today is actually a very special day because it is Tartan Day, a celebration of Scottish heritage held every year on the 6th of April, the date on which the Declaration of Arbroath was signed in 1320. It is largely celebrated by Scots in diaspora, so it is fitting that we mention this before we begin. So when I moved to Cork in the summer of 2015 to join this university, I had in some way convinced myself of this term Celtic connections. But what does this actually mean? And how many different disciplines could accept and reject this? Having lived here now for nearly 2 years, I wanted to test the parameters of this connection and disconnection, especially when it came to Scotland and Ireland, and the same could be said of this imagined divide that we often perceive between religion and enlightenment, where the two shall never meet. It is this assertion that we will also deliberate upon in the next 2 days of this masterclass. Being in the business of religion and the study of religion, and the decade-long conversations that I have had with my friend, my mentor, Alexander Broadie, I found religion and enlightenment as a superb vantage point to critically analyse and question this connection. Broadie published Agreeable Connections, Scottish Enlightenment Links with France in 2013. Might we find another agreeable connection within this masterclass? Now, we live in troubled times with rising right-wing populism and all sorts of European disconnections. These realities often lead us to this desire to find agreeable and pleasant connections. But in some way, what I wanted to do in this masterclass was to move beyond this. In some way, to look more closely and challenge the very notions of not just the connections, but the points of the tension points as well between Scotland and Ireland, religion and enlightenment. For this reason, I would urge particular attention to our deliberations that read against the grain, that interrogate frameworks that are often not highlighted, such as race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality and pluralism. These are significant and critical points to this discussion too. I hope that you will continue with our discussions. Tomorrow we have a very busy day. The program is available, and all of the proceedings will take place here. And I want to take this opportunity to also thank Francesco Fro, who's at the back, busy, who is an Erasmus intern from Italy, who has been assisting me with this masterclass. I have apologies. I have two main apologies. Number one is from the president of the university, who wanted to be here but could not. So he's sent his very good wishes for this masterclass. And the second apology that I have is from Professor Jackie Sheehan, who is the Professor of Asian Studies, at which the study of religion is housed within, and she couldn't make it because she is feeling unwell. So I have the honour of not just introducing the masterclass, but also of introducing my friend. So this could either go very well or terribly wrong. So let me say firstly, and the most important point is that I can't tell too many of your secrets, Alexander. Okay. So Professor Alexander Broadie is the Emeritus Professor of Logic and Rhetoric at the Glasgow University. Important to note that it is the same chair that was held by Adam Smith. Alexander hails from Edinburgh, educated at Edinburgh University, Oxford and also Glasgow. He holds doctorates from Glasgow University, the University of Blaise Pascal, Clermont-Ferrand, I think I said that correctly, and he is his specialist field is in the Scottish philosophical tradition from the Middle Ages to the present day, with a particular interest in the Enlightenment. Please join me in welcoming the keynote address by Professor Alexander Broadie.
Well, this is my first visit ever to the Republic of Ireland, and I've not been here very long, about a day and a half, and I've hugely enjoyed myself so far. And I want to talk about a small sliver of intellectual history where there is displayed a close connection between Scotland and the island of Ireland, with particular reference to Dublin. So I think first of all I will provide a historical contextualization of a philosophical point, and I will then make the philosophical point. The historical contextualization takes us back to the very end of the 17th century and early in the 18th, to the person of Francis Hutcheson, who was born in Drumalrig in 1694 and received a primary education in Saintfield in County Down, where his grandfather, Alexander Hutcheson, was the local minister. And he then received his secondary education in a dissenting academy at Killyleagh, also County Down, which an academy that was run by a Glasgow University graduate named James McCullough, whose idea of preparing a timetable for a dissenting academy was uncomplicated. He simply lifted the one he himself had lived through as an undergraduate at Glasgow University and proceeded to teach his students exactly according to that timetable. Right. So young Francis Hutcheson duly arrived at the University of Glasgow in 1711, so well educated that he went straight into the final year. And having done logic and metaphysics and moral philosophy and some other bits and pieces, his main task was to study natural philosophy, what we now call, very roughly speaking, physics, but it's much wider than that. And he then spent 6 years studying theology under a professor of theology who was in continual trouble with the Kirk, name of John Simpson. And in fact, he was put on trial twice, was this professor, for heresy. He survived both trials, but in the end he was severely punished. That's to say, he was not permitted to teach. All I can say is this is a punishment that a modern teacher could only dream about. After that period of study, St. Francis Hutcheson returned very, very briefly to County Down and then headed for Dublin, where he set up a dissenting academy of his own, became associated with a group of scholars under Lord Molesworth, which a group that included some very, very distinguished people, but they studied philosophy and theology, mainly philosophy, and they had a very liberal, very relaxed view of the way society should go and the constraints that should be placed upon citizens. And during this period, Hutcheson proceeded to write some books, or short books, including something that was more pamphlet than a book, that attracted the attention of Glasgow, that invited him back to the city where he'd got his degree, and to become professor of moral philosophy. Okay. Now, this man was then a very, very influential, very influential source of ideas for the Scottish Enlightenment in general, which is, I guess, one of the two of the great enlightenments, most great enlightenments of the whole Enlightenment movement. The other one being the French Enlightenment, though one shouldn't forget what was going on either in Germany or in the Low Countries. And this was, in a sense, Ireland exerting a huge, huge influence on what was duly going to happen in Scotland. Some people say he was the father of the Scottish Enlightenment, and I don't accept that because, well, there are many other people I could point to who were also very influential. And even today, there seems to be a limit to the number of people an infant can have as father. So the Scottish Enlightenment certainly didn't have only one father. So let's drop that metaphor and just talk about influences. And in that sense, there's no doubt that Hutcheson's influence and the Irish influence on the Scottish Enlightenment was very considerable indeed. And the people who were influenced by him included incredibly distinguished people such as David Hume and Adam Smith. But once Hutcheson had spoken, it was thereafter very difficult within the Scottish Enlightenment to write as if there had been no Hutcheson. So the influence really has to be taken very seriously. In that sense, there is, I think, a wonderful intellectual relationship between the island of Ireland on one side and the Scotland, at the moment not a state of Scotland but a country, on the other. Let me now say something about the idea that was so influential for the Scottish Enlightenment. As regards moral knowledge, you can think of two possible directions. There's a downward direction and there's an upward direction. There's a top-down story that you might tell, and there's a bottom-up story that you might tell. And traditionally, morality was taught as a top-down story. That's to say, where did morality come from? And the answer was it came from the Word of God in His commandments to His creatures. This thou shalt do, this thou shalt not do. And there are an awful lot of commandments. It's not for us to think, how should we live? We are being told how to live by an absolute authority. And where do we get our knowledge from? And the answer is we get our knowledge from sacred scripture, which says what the Word of God is. So not only does God prescribe, but the prescription is there and it's available for us. That is the top-down story. Hugely influenced. Hugely influenced. I would say the whole of Scotland was, and certainly Ireland as well. But Hutcheson was inclined to say something very different. Hutcheson wanted to offer a bottom-up story to all of this, to the whole question of how we should live. And the idea was that we start in an empirical, scientific spirit, look round at human beings, look round at society, and see wherein lies the flourishing, the well-functioning of human beings. What is it that enables people to live in such a way that they can best express themselves, best live with other people? And what Hutcheson particularly wanted to know about is, where does this knowledge come from? Even if there was a truth about morality, how come we can access it? Do we listen to the voice of God, or do we listen to something else? And what he had to say was that wherever we look, we find societies which have moralities. So people have access to the moralities, but the moralities aren't always exactly the same. Nevertheless, somehow people do get an idea that there are obligations, that there are constraints, as well as knowing what are the things that, suit us. There is also a knowledge of how we should live, whether we're going to enjoy the outcome or not. And in developing this idea, which is a humanist story, insofar as it's putting the human beings at the centre of all of this, and treating the human being as an appropriate argument of scientific inquiry, as a way of moving forward on the whole subject of morality, moral norms and social norms. We've got to look at human beings and how we respond to the feelings that we ourselves have, that seem on the whole not to be feelings that are educated into us, but feelings that we have, that we've got to have if we are to be educable into morality at all. So, it seemed to Hutcheson that very often we see a certain kind of behaviour and we are delighted by it, or it gives us pleasure, or we are revolted by it. And this is a revulsion that isn't educated into us, but that arises, as it were, by our nature, and we don't have to be taught to respond in that kind of effective way. But as I say, unless we are capable from within our own resources of responding to certain kinds of behaviour in this way, we are forever going to be incompetent as social beings. So, for example, if I see somebody causing suffering entirely wantonly to another, somebody torturing another just for the fun of it, this is an utterly repellent thing. I will be revolted by it. It will cause me pain just to see it going on. And I won't have been educated into this. I just respond to this. And Hutcheson believed that there are ways of being which are like this, where we have an affective response to what goes on in the world, where the response is a primary fact about us and goes into our very humanity. These feelings that we have, certain things that give us joy and certain things that give us pain, these are feelings that can be refined in a thousand ways. And you might say that every human being throughout their life, I mean to the day they die, every human being is on a learning curve on matters regarding such things, so that we are forever refining our responses in an affective way to what goes on in the world. But we've got to start by responding in some effective way, otherwise the refinement cannot take place. So first and foremost, we are affective beings. And it's because of considerations like this that Hutcheson took on and developed the idea of a moral sense that we have that corresponds to the 5 external senses. The point about the use of the metaphor of sense is first that the knowledge is immediate. It's unmediated. It comes just like that. We see something, we see a certain action, a kindly act being performed, and we are immediately pleased by it. We don't reason our way through to it. And this immediacy is also a characteristic of our senses. We open our eyes and we see what we see. We can then refine our assessment of our visual judgment, but if we can't see in the first place, there is no possibility of refinement. And Hutcheson thought that our moral judgments are very much like this. And the other thing that is characteristic of our external faculties is that the will is not directly engaged. I open my eyes and I don't will to see, I simply see. Okay? I've got earphones on, I can't hear what's going on in the outside world, and I take off the earphones and I can immediately hear. I don't will to hear. I am so made that hearing is what I immediately do. So my reason is not engaged and my hearing is not engaged. The refinements can take place later, but in the first place, I've got to be able to do these things without the exercise of will and without the exercise of the intellect. That's us human beings. And what Hutcheson proceeds to demonstrate is that if this is how we are at the start, then it is possible to show how we can gradually be educated through a process of refinement, so that all of us within a given society are responding, are developing certain feelings, responding in certain ways to certain kinds of behaviour, so that we all tend to be revolted by some kinds of behaviour, and we tend to give our approval to other kinds of behaviour. So gradually there develops a consensus of how we should live. We start to live this way and we can formulate certain rules. Should we all live in this way, then we will all have, to use the word that Aman used at the start, a more agreeable life. All this kind of thinking about these things will lead to a more agreeable way of living for all of us. Now, what's going on here is something that is not top down, but that is bottom up. Just by a close consideration, an empirical consideration of human nature, we are learning how to develop, how to refine our moral ways of looking out on the world, how to refine the moral rules that we are going to live by, so that we can all live a life which is most agreeable to our nature. We can all best flourish. Now, this thought is so far an entirely secular thought, and it would, assuming that the philosophical basis of it is sound, it would have a kind of universality that's really very impressive. It could be used as the basis for developing a morality for human beings, and not just for human beings who, for example, live as members of one particular faith community rather than any other faith community. It would be the basis of a genuinely universal, humane ethic. These were ideas which I'm developing just now that you find in the early writings of Francis Hutcheson while he was working in Dublin. These ideas attracted the teaching staff, the academic staff of the University of Glasgow, and they invited him to the chair of moral philosophy, which he accepted, and from there he proceeded to have immense influence through his pupils and more generally through his writings, through all the universities in Scotland at that time, which in the early 18th century, in fact from the late 16th century, had numbered 5. Okay. Now, amongst his pupils was Adam Smith. And Adam Smith always spoke with the greatest gratitude of what he had learned from Hutcheson. He thought Hutcheson himself was a wonderful man who in many ways embodied the values that he was trying to teach his students. And I should add that he tried to engage his students in a practical way, so they didn't just know about the values, the moral values that he was talking about, but should come to see the value of those values, so that he was trying to mould their characters at the same time that he was trying to teach them some philosophy. Smith was very impressed with this, and as I say, he ran with the ball. Somebody who was less impressed by that detail was David Hume, because Hume on one occasion sought the chair of moral philosophy at Edinburgh University, and Hutcheson was asked for his opinion on this application, and said that he was very unhappy about it, and he gave a serious criticism of Hume, namely that he lacked warmth in the cause of virtue. It was indeed true that Hume spoke about virtue, and very, very impressively, but there was no warmth there, so one was not necessarily inclined to follow the path of virtue, having attended the lectures of Hume on the subject of virtue. Hutcheson had a different attitude to the whole question of the role of a moral philosophy professor. That's all I want to say about that for the moment, though there is a good deal more to be said, which we might talk about later. But Adam Smith, as I say, ran with this ball, and he based his moral philosophy on the concept of sympathy, which was also hugely important to Hutcheson. Smith pointing out that sympathy is part of the original constitution or the original frame of our human nature. We look at some people, they are happy, and happiness wells up in us at the sight of their happiness. Not always, of course not. There's also an assumption to be made about what it is that's bringing them happiness. If somebody is enjoying being brutal to another human being, then we don't sympathize with this. We are repelled by it. But the point remains a Hutchisonian point, that we are so made that we have a natural tendency to respond affectively to other people, to the way they behave. But of course, sometimes the behaviour, we think the behaviour of others is not at all satisfactory. They are going wildly over the top, for example, and we can't sympathise with that. And Adam Smith has got some very interesting things to say about the way, if we find somebody responding in an excessive way, we try to get them to cool it a bit, and the person will perhaps, wishing to be judged in an agreeable way, will start to cool it a bit. And so you will find two people, as it were, negotiating between themselves as to the appropriate way to behave in given circumstances, a kind of negotiation. There is in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations a lot said about the commercial process of truck, barter and exchange. You take your goods to the market, you haggle over the price, and then when a price is agreed upon, one that's not too high for the buyer and not too low for the seller, then there is a due exchange of the cash on the one side and the goods on the other. And what Smith is saying is that in a way, that kind of haggling, that kind of negotiating is always going on in society, always going on when two people are engaged with each other, so they can find a level at which they can treat each other in a suitably civil way. Now, all of this is used by Smith as a means towards producing a superbly sophisticated account of the way our morality develops in the course of all of us on a lifelong learning curve, learning how to respond to others in such a way that we can share our lives with others and flourish in the circumstances that we have created amongst ourselves. That is a bottom-up approach to morality. It's a very humanist story. Now, to the last point that I want to make about this, in a way, this is a surprising story to tell about Hutcheson, who spent 6 years studying theology, preparatory to becoming a minister in a Presbyterian Calvinist church. It's a moral story that's not in the least top down. And indeed, in the first of his great works on virtue, on the origins of the idea of virtue, you read about 100 pages before God comes into sight. So when all the premises are laid out, then there is some indication that there is a religious dimension to our lives. Is there not some contradiction here? And the answer is very much no. There isn't. Let me explain how this is so. You've got a top-down story. God says, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, etc. In that order. So Hutcheson comes along and says, no, here is a way, a completely natural or natural scientific way in which we can show how a morality can develop amongst human beings, whether or not there is a God, whether or not there is religion. So he shows, Adam Smith shows, that even if there is a society in which there is no religious consciousness, that could still be a society in which people can behave virtuously and maybe do. At the latter end of the 17th century, this was a major topic, by the way, was an atheistic, virtuous society possible? It was a contentious matter, but there were people who said yes. And there were even religious people who said yes. So what's going on here? The answer is this, and I need look no further than Hutcheson to provide the answer. He was a cradle Calvinist. To the best of my knowledge, he believed in God till his dying day. But at the same time, he thought it was possible for there to be a virtuous atheist. Is this not a contradiction? The answer is no. Let us suppose that God does indeed exist, and that the God in question is the God of the Bible, who provided a list of commandments. This you will do, this you will not do. This constitutes a proper human mode of living. Okay. We surely are not to suppose that God created human beings with a nature that was incompatible with his commandments, so that either we could not think those commandments up for ourselves, or we could not obey them. So let us suppose that there is indeed a benign creator God who creates creatures whom he wishes to live in a certain sort of way. We are therefore to suppose, I think, that those creatures are of such a way that they have a creaturely root to a knowledge of these moral things that I have been talking about. So that even if we did not believe in a God, even if we did not have access to the divine pages in which this moral knowledge was set out, it would still be possible for us to work out what these moral norms are by a scientific consideration of what we can see to be our human nature. And this is to say that there are two possible routes to moral knowledge, very different in kind. One of them is via Holy Scripture, and the other is via our own unaided intellectual activities, but activities that we are all capable of. I speak about scientific knowledge, but I don't mean that we need to be Einsteins in order to have access to this kind of knowledge. And we all have scientific knowledge of the world, at least sufficient to enable us to knock about the world more or less successfully. We've got a jolly good intuitive idea of gravity. I know that if I let go of things, they will tend to fall. And if they're heavy, then they will fall faster than a feather will fall. Okay. And don't tell me about Galileo. I know that even what I've just said has got to be refined. But the outcome is this, that moral knowledge can indeed be provided and validly provided by a consideration of Scripture, and can also be provided and validly provided by human beings, not by that top-down method, but by the bottom-up method of considering human nature, the way human beings live with each other, the way human beings have got to modify their behaviour towards each other in order to be able to live comfortably with each other and in order to be able to live flourishing human lives. So that this story, told within the Scottish Enlightenment, mainly, by the way, by ministers of that Kirk, this story of the development of moral knowledge that does not require the existence of God as a premise in the argument, does not point to this being in any way an aggressively atheistical story. Very far from it. It's entirely compatible with a distinctly religious, theological story that these same moralists were fully prepared and willing and anxious to pass on to their students. So the fact that you do have moral knowledge which you could access in an utterly secular way, in an utterly secular spirit, says nothing whatsoever about the validity or otherwise of particular religious claims. So there is no essentially atheistical thrust to this secular story. And this was a story that was being told by Hutcheson in considerable detail, that was exported into the Scottish Enlightenment after Hutcheson's time in Dublin, and that was then spread far and wide through the Scottish Enlightenment. Thank you.